Excellent. All right, so a couple of weeks ago, we finished our journey through the Gospel of Luke, and today we're going to begin a brand new teaching series, which is based on the prophecies that were given to one of the towering ancient prophets of the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah. Now, we're in a series called Isaiah, and you're going to hear me say it like that a lot, Isaiah. And I know you don't say it like that, you say Isaiah. I've been here for 25 years, and there's lots of different words and pronunciations that I've picked up because I've been able to. I just can't do that one. I don't know why, it just doesn't come out right. So I'm sorry, you're going to have to put up with Isaiah. Isaiah. I can't make it sound like that. I can't do it. I'm sorry. So it's going to be Isaiah, I'm afraid, and you're going to have to just put up with it. Forgive me. So we are taking a look at the book of the prophecies of this man, and if you know the book, you know that it is a vast book of the Old Testament. It is a dominant and powerful book, and if you've ever read it, you know it's a bit of a hard slog. It's 66 chapters long. It's a big book. And it is often one that we kind of trudge through a little bit. And not just Isaiah, but other prophets as well. They're just not easy to read, are they? Like, I don't think any of us think, well, that was an easy read. I fully understood all of it. They're just not easy. And there's a few reasons for that. Reason number one is that you and I don't regularly read prophetic oracles. That isn't a genre of literature that we're used to reading in general life and in culture. So we're just not familiar with it. And so it is just a little bit tricky. Now, there is some story in it. When Isaiah confronts Hezekiah, there's actually some story in there, and we'll see a bit of that. But it is not, most of it is like Hebrew poetry. So we're just not used to it. And it's a little bit different to the Psalms. The Psalm you can read sort of poetically, but in Isaiah it's just a little bit different. In the prophets it's a bit different, and it's hard. The other reason is that most of us don't have all of the historical context. So there's all kind of connections that we miss, and that's not because there's anything wrong with us. We just don't know it, most of us. Even somebody like me who's been studying this stuff for 30 years, and has a degree in it and spends a lot of time in it. Even I will read passages and say, yeah, I just don't remember what the historical context is here. So we miss a lot of points of connection. So it just isn't easy. It's a tough one. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look. I think we have 7 sermons in this series. So we're only going to scratch the surface. We're not going to go through all of it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take out some of the major themes, some of the very preachable passages that you will recognize, but also, as well as preaching, what is this saying to us today, I'm also going to try to connect it for you to the structure and the overall message of the book, because I think that's helpful. So if you're somebody who makes notes, you regularly make notes, you might want to make notes of the next 2 things because it will help you for the next few weeks. If there's a couple of ways that I can give you a little bit of structure for this, which will help you get a handle on the text, this is them, and I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. You can split the book in 2. So you can split it between chapters 1 to 39 and 40 to 66. And scholars and people in biblical studies will often call the first part the book of judgment, and the second part, the book of comfort. And it literally, you can sort of divide it that way. So the first 39 verses do contain a lot of judgment, divine judgment, God bringing judgment to people because of their sin and the wickedness of their ways. And so you get all these like mini oracles, these mini prophecies within the prophecy. So, woe is Egypt, and, woe is Assyria, and woe is Moab, and woe is Philistia. So you get all of these kind of mini prophecies of judgment on the nations that surround Israel. And then you also get, and woe is Israel. And I think it's a little bit of a shocker, a little bit of a surprise probably for them. And so what you have, really quickly, Israel was one big nation under King David, It was one big nation under King Solomon, but after that, it actually split in two, and many of you know that. It split into two separate nations with two separate kings. So you had Israel in the north, sometimes referred to as Ephraim, and that was the sort of 10 of the tribes. And you had Judah in the south, which is actually technically Judah and Simeon. Simeon got kind of assimilated into Judah in the south. So you had these two separate nations, but they're all still the people of God, right? They're just in two separate nations. So you get this, woe is Israel, woe is Judah. And so you can imagine Israelites or people from Judah, whatever you want to call them, sitting there rubbing their hands, saying, woe to Egypt, yeah. Woe to Moab, yeah. Woe to Assyria, yeah. Like, woe to our enemies. And then all of a sudden it's, and woe to, and maybe they're thinking, maybe it's the Philistines next, and it's woe to Israel. Woe to Judah. What? We weren't expecting that. But absolutely, God speaks judgment on Israel and Judah because just because you're the chosen people doesn't mean that you can act however you want, you can mistreat others, you can worship idols, you can live in profound injustice. You should know better. So that's kind of what you get in 1 to 39. So if you're getting lost in the weeds, you can kind of remember, okay, yeah, the first part is judgment on the nations for wickedness, sin, and so on. You get to verse 40, and all of a sudden it says, comfort, O comfort, my people, says your God, speak tenderly to Jerusalem. And you get a shift. And 40 to 66 is called the Book of Comfort. And so you get way more hope in there. And it's probably the simplest way to understand the book of Isaiah is by splitting it in that way. It's not to say that there's no comfort in the first 39 chapters. And it's not to say there isn't any judgment in 40 to 66. But generally speaking, you can kind of split it that way. So the message, I, God, must bring judgment because I'm a just God. If I don't, then justice lacks in me. However, bringing you through punishment, bringing you through judgment, I want to bless you and give you a grand future. I want you to know the hope that I have for you because I love you. So that is the simplest way to describe the message of Isaiah to you. Another way, again, if you like to write things down, this will help you also. Another way is to picture it like this. The book is a movement from human failure, divine holiness, messianic hope, restored future. Sounds a little bit like the gospel, doesn't it? So, human failure, and this isn't in perfect chronology. It isn't like I take those verses, then those chapters, and then those chapters. It's sort of mixed in, but generally speaking, this is the sweep of the story. So you have human failure. Humans have sinned. God must bring punishment and judgment. Divine holiness. We get these pictures in it of God on his throne. We're going to read about that in chapter 6 in a few moments. So you get this divine holiness. You realize there is a gulf between those two things. There is an unpassable chasm between the wicked sinfulness of humanity and the glory of God. But how is it going to be resolved? Well, it's going to be resolved because there's messianic hope. That's how he's going to fix this dilemma and this issue. There are 14 prophecies of the Messiah, fairly detailed prophecies, found throughout the prophecy of Isaiah. So you'll recognize some of one. There is the branch of David. There is the virgins Emmanuel. We read about that at Christmas time. There is the Prince of Peace. We read about that at Christmas time. Also, there's a lot of Isaiah in the New Testament. You get the righteous king from David, etc. There's 14 of them. So you have messianic hope leading to a restored future. The book of Revelation is not the only book that talks about the new heavens and the new earth. Isaiah talked about it. So you see there's an arc to the book. There's a message. There's an overarching story. That is sort of helpful as well. So these two things you can kind of hold up. If ever you're reading the book of Isaiah and you're getting confused because you're like, oh, woe is this, woe is that, this is difficult, I don't know what he's talking about, I don't know all the historical background, this is tough, you're lost in the weeds, or you're listening to a sermon series like what I'm going to preach you and you're getting a bit lost, you can hold these two things up and say, okay, but I do know the general story, the general message, the overall structure, the arc. So hopefully that is helpful for you as we dive in. So who's Isaiah? Well, he was an Old Testament prophet. I think you guessed that one already. Many think he was a member of the royal court because he had access to kings. He actually got audiences with kings. He actually spoke to Hezekiah. So many people think he was maybe a member of the royal court, or if he wasn't officially a member, he certainly had access to royalty. So he would have lived in Jerusalem. Most of his prophecy was directed at Judah in the south, where Jerusalem was the capital. He was married. He had a wife. He had a couple of sons are mentioned in the letter as well. So it's likely then he was married and he had these two sons. And he most likely died under Manasseh's reign. If you know who King Manasseh is from the book of Kings, you know he was a pretty wicked king, pretty awful. He actually repented towards the end of his life. You don't pick that up in the book of Kings, you pick it up in Chronicles. But he actually repented. But most of his life, he was a pretty wicked king. And many people think that Isaiah suffered, or tradition says he suffered under Manasseh in a pretty nasty way. The book of Hebrews kind of mentions it, but we won't. I'm not going to mention that today. So you ready to lean in with me? Isaiah 1, verse 1 says this. The vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So I said the message was largely about Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Okay, so now we know the historical background. Well, we don't know it, but we know a little bit about it. It was during the reigns of those kings. It was during their reign that the northern kingdom of Israel went into exile by the Assyrian Empire. They took them into exile. Judah hung on a little bit longer. I'll talk about that again in a minute. Right away, we know he was alive and these kings were reigning, and he was prophesying in the 8th century BC, the 700s BC. Judah, in the 8th century, was a sad, sad shadow of its former past under King David. When David was king in Jerusalem, the nation was in its golden era. It was big and powerful. It was the same under Solomon's reign. He built the temple. He built all of these palaces. They became ridiculously wealthy. It was a golden age for Israel. By the time we got to the 8th century, Uzziah's reign, that first king, wasn't too bad. But after he dies, because the nation was somewhat prosperous, after he died, things got bad. And that's the point at which Isaiah steps in and says, there's a reason it's getting bad. By the way, Ahaz, Jotham, and Hezekiah, there's a reason it's getting bad. Let me tell you what it is. So this is when he was prophesying and what he was, largely speaking, prophesying about. So economically precarious, getting bullied by bigger sort of nations, so geopolitics was kind of an issue. They were spiritually weakened because of syncretism. Syncretism is when you say, yes, we're going to worship Yahweh, but we'll also worship the gods of the Canaanites because, we want to. Syncretism is when you worship more than one God. And so today we would say there are certain places in the world where the Catholic Church is, or Protestant church as well, but particularly the Catholic Church, where people worship Jesus in the Catholic Church, but they also worship some of their ancestral gods still because that's tradition and that's what they need to do. That's syncretism, right? It's not a very politically correct thing for me to say, but I'm just saying what it is. The same thing for, let's put it into today and us and here. If there are Christians who worship Jesus and also do crystals and read tarot cards and read their horoscopes and do all those kind of things, that's syncretism. You will be spiritually weakened if you do that. All right? Again, people get a little upset when you say things like that, but I don't know what else to say. That is syncretism. you will be spiritually weakened. So, in the book of Deuteronomy, when the people move away from God's law and God's ways, judgment will come upon them. The curses, faithfulness will bring blessing. We know that Israel and Judah struggled to stay strong to the law of Moses and the warnings of Moses, and they ended up being faithless. So Jotham and Ahaz's reign in particular were rough going for the nation. The nation wasn't following God. They continued to be wicked and sinful leaders. They led Judah into further sin and turmoil. Around this time, as I said, Assyria came in and took Israel off to exile. The only reason that Judah survived and didn't go into exile, it lasted about another 150 years-ish. Then it went into exile when Babylon was now the big world empire after Assyria had fallen. And King Nebuchadnezzar took them into exile. The only reason they lasted longer than Israel did under Assyria is because Ahaz, Jotham, Hezekiah, the fourth of those kings that are listed, actually led a religious revival. And people turned back to God, and they repented, and they tore down the high places where they did ancestral worship and worship of Baal and these other gods. They turned back to God, and largely because of the ministry of, you guessed it, Isaiah. Isaiah went to Hezekiah and said, do you see where the nation is going? Do you see this threatening nation of Assyria, surrounding us, ready to kind of take us off into exile and destroy us? Here's the book of Deuteronomy. We were told this would happen by God if we broke the Mosaic law. So Hezekiah says, I heed your message. Let's go back and turn and repent. And they got delivered, and they lasted longer. So that's kind of the story. Let's dive into Isaiah 6, 1-8. If you're a visual person, it might help you to close your eyes and try to visualize this if you want to. And I'll just read it to you. But if you prefer to just follow along, you can. In the year, this is Isaiah 6, starting at verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, that's that first king, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, that's angels. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And they called to one another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am. Send me. God's word to us today. Amen. That is an account of the calling of Isaiah. That's the commissioning of Isaiah. And we're told right up front, it happened the day that King Uzziah died. So after him, the next king came to the throne because he didn't die in retirement. He died on the job. Uzziah dies, and we can accurately date that to 740 BC. So in 740 BC, Isaiah began to utter, we had his vision, and then he became a prophet and started to utter the words of God after that calling. Things began to head south after Uzziah's death. Isaiah needed to speak and be the voice of God into this situation to the people, warning them, saying, You're going down a slippery slope. So prophets are like warning signs, and you've maybe heard me say this before. They're like warning signs. So there are street signs out on the streets of Abbotsford, and some of them tell you when you're driving that you need to keep to this speed. And other ones say you need to yield here. And other ones say, by the way, this is a school zone, so you need to slow down. They're warning signs. They're telling us, they're giving drivers instructions. And if you disobey them, there's a chance, if you get caught, that you will be punished. You will receive judgment for breaking the laws. You will get a ticket. And if you do it again soon, you will get maybe a more expensive ticket. And if you keep doing it and we keep catching you, we may take your driving license away from you. And you know what? We may even impound your car. There is judgment based on the breaking of the law. So that's what a prophet is. Think of a prophet as like a street sign. The prophet is holding up a sign saying, instead of pointing to Canadian driving laws, it's pointing instead to the law of Moses and saying, hey, nation, remember the law? Remember what God said? Remember the law? Well, you need to obey them. And if you don't, there's a list at the end of Deuteronomy of curses that'll come upon you as a nation. And if you keep breaking it, the punishments will get worse. And if you persist in your sin, it will get worse and worse to the point that in the end, God will just say, well, I'm taking my hand of blessing off you. And we are going to be kicked out of the land promised to Abraham, our land. We're going to go into exile if we don't hear. So that's what a prophet is. A prophet is a warning sign saying, guys, come on, wake up. On the day Uzziah died, when Uzziah is being called into action, he has this vision. And it was a glorious vision. He saw God sitting on a throne. Where have we seen that before, church? Remember Revelation when we preached through that? That wonderful vision of the throne room in chapter 4 of Revelation. The Apostle John is on the island of Patmos on the Lord's Day. He's in the Spirit, and he begins to get these troubling visions and pictures and so on. And one of them was of a throne room in heaven, and he was invited up to look through a door, and he did. He went up, and he saw this throne room. And in this throne room was God seated on a throne with 4 living creatures and fire everywhere, and a sea of glass and 24 elders. You remember that? It's this glorious vision in the book of Revelation. And you may remember what I said to you then was that chapter 4 is like a set of glasses that we put on, and it gives us our worldview. And then we can see the rest of the book of Revelation. We can understand it a bit better if we put our glasses on. Because the message is this: when the world gets bad, and Revelation is going to talk about the world getting bad, when Revelation talks about judgments and this happening, and this happening, and this happening, you can remember that there is a God in heaven that is seated on a throne. In other words, there's a throne room, a control room of the universe, and it's not empty. There's someone sitting on it. God is in control. So we don't need to fear. So in your life, when things are becoming difficult and hard and you're struggling and you're suffering, you can remember there is a God on the throne who loves you and has a plan for you and is taking you somewhere. You've heard me talk about a thin veil that separates our earthly realm with the spiritual realm, and occasionally it gets drawn back. It's like a curtain that gets drawn back. Well, the Apostle John, it was drawn back from him, and he got to peer into the heavenlies. And so did Isaiah. It got drawn back, and he was able to peer into the heavenlies and get this vision because God needed to set him apart for this role. As he sees God on the throne, it says the hem of his garment fills the temple. Just the hem, just the very edge of his garment. Now, in the holy place, you may know this, in the temple, you've got the Holy of Holies, which was kind of this cube-shaped place that only the high priest could go. And inside of that, there was the Ark of the Covenant, inside of which was the Ten Commandments. And it's all overlaid in gold, and there were these cherubim, and they were kind of carved on the edges of it. And in between the cherubim was the mercy seat, or the atonement cover that covered it there. And it was believed that the manifest presence of God himself took up residence between the cherubim on the mercy seat, the seat of mercy. Now, the Ark of the Covenant wasn't really that big. So you'd be forgiven for saying, well, God must be pretty small, right? If he can fit between the cherubim. That would be a fair conclusion, except here we're told that he's seated on a throne, and just the hem of his garment not only filled that space in between the cherubim, not only filled the holy place, but actually filled the entire temple, just the hem of his garment. So God is actually really big. It tells us that he's the one true king who's on the throne. So for Isaiah, whatever the earthly kings do, whether Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah respond to his preaching or not, whatever they do, whatever the king of Assyria does, whether they listen to him, not the Assyrian king, but the other ones, there's actually a passage right after the one we read that gets quoted often in the New Testament when Jesus is giving parables that says, seeing they'll never understand, and so on. Looking, you won't comprehend. And so there's already a suggestion that they're not going to listen to him. Even if they don't listen and the nation falls apart, even if the Assyrian king comes over, the horizon and starts marching towards Jerusalem, even if those things happen, we know that there's a king seated on the throne whose the hem of his garment fills the temple. As he gazes at this one on the throne, there are angels singing, "Holy, holy, holy." There's angels in Revelation too. Angels show up in Ezekiel and other places. They're not all described exactly the same, but they're described similarly. And they're crying, "Holy." They're worshiping God in the throne room. And as they cry holy, it says the whole earth is filled with his glory. The whole earth is filled with his glory. Well, yes, it's not just the ark, and it's not even just the Holy of Holies, and it's not just the temple. It's the whole earth that is filled with the glory. So God's even bigger. He's huge. The place begins to shake. Corners of the building begin to shake before the power and the might of God. Just at the voices, it begins to shake and everything starts to react. And this experience causes something to happen in finite Isaiah, human man Isaiah. He says this, "Woe is me. Woe is me. I'm an unclean, sinful human, and I live among an unclean human people, and yet I've seen the glory of God. I'm in trouble. I'm just going to burn up in his holiness. I'm dead." He's overwhelmed by what he sees. Church family, it's so often the case that when people come into the manifest presence of God, when they encounter God in a really, really powerful and significant way, they immediately come face to face with their own mortality and their own depravity. Standing before a perfectly holy God, we realize we don't have a leg to stand on. Earlier I mentioned the gap that exists between divine holiness and human rebellion and human sin, this unpassable chasm. The only way we believe we can cross that chasm and be okay is by the extravagant grace of God. And so as New Testament believers, we understand that to be the cross of Jesus Christ. It's the only way we can approach him. Without him, without his cross, woe is us. Because he's holy and we are not. It's all because of Jesus. So often in the history of the church, when when people get caught up in revivals, and I understand there's some controversy around revivals. There's often a lot of flesh that gets involved in there as well, and a lot of stuff like that. But there's also a lot of genuineness in revivals as well. And often in revivals, throughout history, the response seems to be the same of the people who go to revival places, who get involved in revivals. It's always the same. That they weep, there's tears, they fall on their face before God, they worship for hours on end, they lose all sense of time because they get into the manifest presence of God that has been uniquely poured out in that place for that time. I wonder if any in the room have ever experienced actually a revival before. They've happened all throughout history. I have once, just a little bit of one. And there's nothing quite like it. There's nothing quite like it. One of the seraphs, one of the angels, takes a live coal from the altar of sacrifice and takes it to the one who says he's got unclean lips, and he blots out the sin. Isaiah has been forgiven of his sin, and now he's prepared to respond to his call. Whom shall we send? Well, send me. I can go then. Forgiveness, mercy. The fact that this call narrative is placed in chapter 6 and not chapter 1 is a little bit odd, don't you think? Why is it not at the beginning? Because shouldn't that be where the call starts? Because this is when he becomes a prophet. Well, let me tell you this. Chapters 1 to 5, if you read them, are part of the book of judgment. So, you guessed it, there's a lot of judgment there. And it describes the dilemma that human beings are in. They're a people of unclean lips. They are a sinful people. And it's kind of unpacked for you in 1 to 5, and lots of other places as well. How can this group of rebellious, unclean, corrupt people who keep rebelling against God and defying his instruction, how can they ever stand in the presence of God and fulfill their calling and those kind of things? Well, God can deal with them in the same way that he's dealt with Isaiah. He can blot out their sin and reorient their moral compass, and they can once again become the people that God has called them to be. So the call in chapter 6, Isaiah's encounter with God, serves as an example of how that can play out. It answers how the dilemma can be resolved. The dilemma presented in 1 to 5 can be resolved this way. And as I said earlier, it's the gospel. It's the gospel. Forgiveness, mercy. So we're going to go to communion in a moment. But first, let me just tie up a couple of things. You and I, as Christians, often emphasize the goodness of God as it relates to our new standing we have before him because of the cross. And we sing things like, what a friend we have in Jesus. And we talk about God being our Father. And then, we kind of check in with him now and again. And we offer up prayers of thanks before we eat. And we slip into treating him maybe a little bit like a kindly old man in the sky with a long beard who's just really nice. And there's truth to some of that. I mean, he is our Father. Jesus is our friend. We were once enemies, but we were made friends because of the cross of Christ. He is our friend. Those things are true. Except there's some other things that we have to emphasize about God, and this passage does it. God is also holy and awe-inspiring and otherworldly and powerful, and if we're honest, a little bit overwhelming. He's a bit overwhelming. Because when we grasp those truths, we remember just how far the gulf is between us and him that I talked about earlier. We really are lost on the other side of that unpassable chasm. But here we have, in Isaiah's vision in chapter 6, we have an early indication of the blotting out of sin and the burning away of sin that anticipates the full and final complete forgiveness that will come to all of those who have put their faith in Jesus Christ because of the sacrifice of the cross. So what we have here this morning is human rebellion and divine holiness. And what we're going to see is more of that through the series, but we're also going to see plenty of prophecy that constitutes messianic hope that is going to fix the problem that we're in that Isaiah lays out. Messianic hope, and that will land us eventually in a restored future. The gospel according to Isaiah. So that leads us so perfectly to communion.